You bought an abandoned gold mine for $1. Then you found the tunnel they erased. A 1951 map showed 600 feet of underground work that vanished from every map made after it. Not marked closed, not marked collapsed, gone. And if somebody took the time to erase 600 feet of underground work from the official record, there are only two possibilities. Either the tunnel was a mistake nobody wanted remembered, or there was something at the end of it worth hiding. 3 weeks earlier, you did not think you were buying a mystery. You thought you were buying a useless piece of desert. The listing looked almost ridiculous. An old mining property with a small private surface parcel, one rusted gate, a collapsed equipment shed, and a portal that had not produced commercial gold in more than 70 years. The transfer price was $1. Everything else was your problem. A gold mine for $1 sounds like a scam until you read what comes with it. Property taxes, fencing, inspections, liability, old workings that have to stay secured, a road that washes out every few years, no electricity, no water, no promise that the underground levels are even usable. The seller was not giving away proven gold. He was transferring an old site that cost money to own. You were not planning to become a miner. You liked the land, the history, and the absurdity of owning a gold mine for less than lunch. For $1, the paperwork felt worth it. The closing took less than a week. The transfer documents made the bargain look even less magical. The seller guaranteed nothing about the value of the mineral interest, the condition of the workings, or continued access on the old road. You were taking the property as it stood, defects included. You called 2 people before signing. One told you old mines were usually worth less than empty land because empty land does not come with holes in it. The other asked whether you understood that $1 was the cheapest part of the purchase. You understood enough to hesitate. Then you checked the public records. No active production, no modern drilling, no recent exploration permits. Nothing suggesting somebody else had quietly discovered value and was trying to dump a problem on you. The mine really did look dead. That was enough to make the price believable. Nobody knowingly sells a documented, valuable ore body for $1. But an old mine with no active production, no modern drilling, and a long list of obligations can be worth less to its owner than the cost of keeping it. So you signed. At that point, the most valuable thing you expected to own was probably the view from the ridge. Along with the deed came 4 cardboard boxes from a storage unit. Old tax receipts, equipment invoices, payroll fragments, photographs. Maps folded so many times the paper had turned soft along the creases. Most of it was exactly what you expected from a dead mine. Numbers getting smaller, repairs getting cheaper, production dropping year after year. Then you opened a map dated October 1951. At first, nothing looked strange. The main adit entered from the west. A haulage drift ran under the ridge. 2 crosscuts branched north. Another headed southeast. Every line had measurements, elevation marks, and small handwritten notes from whoever surveyed the workings. But near the lower right corner was a branch labeled simply 7B. It began at the 2nd level, turned east, and continued for almost 600 feet. You unfolded the next map, March 1952. Same main adit, same lower level, same north crosscuts, same bends in the haulage drift. No 7B. You put the maps on top of each other because you assumed you were reading them wrong. You were not. The tunnel had not been shortened. It had not been relabeled. The survey did not show a cave-in symbol, a barricade, or an abandoned heading. The line simply stopped existing. One question kept coming back. Why would a mining company erase a tunnel from its own map? The closer you compared the 2 sheets, the harder that omission was to dismiss. Because the 1952 map was not a rough sketch. It was cleaner than the one from 1951. Someone had redrawn the entire lower level carefully enough to preserve minor curves in the main drift. They copied useless dead ends. They copied ventilation raises. They copied a storage niche barely 20 feet deep. But they left out 600 feet of excavation. That was not forgetting. That was choosing. You photographed both maps and enlarged the lower right corner on your computer. That made the difference even stranger. On the 1951 sheet, 7B was drawn with the same survey style as every other active heading. Station marks, distance ticks, a turning point, a final face. Whoever drew it had not added the tunnel casually. It had been measured. The 1952 sheet used many of the same station numbers elsewhere in the mine. That meant the person who redrafted it probably had access to the older survey. They were not reconstructing the workings from memory. You started comparing things nobody would bother to fake if they were simply simplifying the map. A short sump was still there. A ventilation connection was still there. A dead-end cut only 32 feet long was still there. 600 feet of 7B was not. Then you noticed something even smaller. The point where 7B should have left the main drift had been redrawn as a smooth wall line. Not an unfinished branch. Not a blank spot. A wall. The newer map did not merely fail to show a tunnel. It showed the place where the tunnel began, as if solid ground had always been there. That distinction sounds tiny, until you remember why old workings are mapped in the first place. Surveyors need to know where drifts, raises, shafts, and abandoned headings actually are. A real passage disappearing from a later survey is not a harmless cleanup. Whoever redrew the lower level had made a deliberate omission. The next morning, you drove back to the property with both maps in the passenger seat. The mine entrance was exactly as unimpressive as the listing photos. A steel gate. Weathered rock. A faded warning plate with most of the paint gone. Behind it, darkness that swallowed the beam of your flashlight after a few yards. You did not go inside. Not yet. Old mines kill people who think curiosity counts as training. Bad air, rotten timber, hidden shafts, unstable rock overhead. So you hired a mine safety contractor to inspect the accessible workings and tell you whether the second level could even be reached under controlled conditions. 2 days later, he called. The upper workings were rough, but stable enough for a controlled inspection. The lower level had one problem. A section near the east side was sealed. You asked if it looked collapsed. He said no. It looked built. That was different. A collapse could explain why a tunnel went out of use. A built seal meant somebody had closed the opening on purpose. And the 1951 map told you exactly where that opening should be. The old 1951 survey placed the entrance to 7B just beyond a bend in the second-level drift. On the modern inspection, that same location looked like solid rock. But solid rock does not usually have squared timber buried inside it. Behind loose rubble, the contractor found the end of a rail. A mine rail. It entered the wall and disappeared. You stood there staring at it, because a rail does not run into a natural wall unless the wall came later. The tunnel on the map had been real. Somebody had filled its entrance. 7B was real. Now you needed to know what happened in it before someone filled the entrance and redrew the map. You started with the paperwork. The county records office sat 2 towns away, inside a building that smelled like dust and old carpet. Most of the mine files were not dramatic. Lease renewals, equipment liens, tax notices. One complaint about runoff, a transfer of machinery after the closure. Then a production statement from 1951 gave you a timeline. The mine had been declining for years. In 1948, it still shipped regular ore. By 1950, shipments had become smaller and less frequent. In early 1951, the company cut staff. And in January 1952, it filed a notice saying the remaining known ore was no longer economic to mine. That seemed to support the official story. The mine was tired. The vein was weak. The company shut down. Except 7B had been driven during the worst part of that decline. Driving 600 feet of new tunnel is not what a broke company does for fun. It costs labor, timber, explosives, rail, ventilation, time. So why spend money extending a mine everybody already believed was dying? A payroll book from one of the storage boxes gave you the next clue. For most of 1951, the entries were ordinary. Names, hours, deductions, job codes. Then, late in the year, 6 men began receiving extra shifts after the normal crew had signed out. The job code beside those entries was 7B. No explanation. No production number, no ore tonnage, just 7B. 5 weeks of after-hours work. That did not mean 6 men had driven the entire 600 feet in 5 weeks. The October map already showed 7B near its full surveyed length. It meant the company kept a dedicated crew working its east end after the regular operation was winding down. You went back through the boxes and found an old photograph you had ignored the first time. 6 men stood beside a timber set underground, dirty helmets pushed back, lunch tins at their feet. A chalkboard behind them carried the same 2-character code, 7B. Now you had faces for the after-hours crew. But one face created another problem. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a surname and the word accident. The county archive had death certificates on microfilm. The man in the photograph died in December 1951. Cause of death? Crushing injuries associated with mining work. Place of death? The mine property you now owned. You checked the state mine inspector's accident summaries for that month. Nothing. No fatality at the mine. No collapse listed. No underground incident matching the date. A man died in a mining accident on the property while the 7B crew was working after hours, and the heading vanished from the next surviving map. At that point, a simple drafting mistake became very hard to believe. You searched local newspapers next, expecting the death to be the obvious answer. There were small reports about layoffs, a machinery auction, and one notice saying the company was reducing operations. Nothing about a fatal underground accident. Then you found a 3-line item from the week the worker died. It said a local miner had been killed in an industrial accident and that funeral services would be held privately. The mine was not named. That omission could have meant nothing. Small newspapers made mistakes. Families asked for privacy. Records from 75 years ago were incomplete. But the absence kept repeating in exactly the places where 7B should have appeared. No accident report. No assay sheet. No final tunnel on the 1952 map. Missing evidence is not proof by itself, but when several independent records all develop the same blind spot at the same time, the blind spot becomes part of the evidence. You also found minutes from a county meeting discussing a boundary dispute involving 2 mineral properties east of the mine. The language was vague. It did not identify 7B and did not say gold had been found. But the date was late 1951, while the after-hours crew was still working. Now there were 3 events running on top of each other. An exploration tunnel pushing east, a dispute involving ground east of the mine, and a fatal accident inside the same 5-week window. Put the dates together, and the tunnel started to look less like a forgotten heading and more like a problem. A boundary dispute to the east, 5 weeks of after-hours work in 7B, a fatal accident before the end of the year. Something happened there. You still did not know whether management was hiding the death, a discovery, or both. There was one document that might answer it. Assay sheets. Exploration headings are normally sampled as they advance. Those assays tell a crew whether the rock is improving, getting worse, or worth following. If 7B had been driven to test new ground, there should have been sample results tied to it. You found sheets for almost every other heading, not 7B. Then, inside the back cover of the payroll ledger, you found a torn strip of paper with 4 sample numbers written in pencil. No grades, no dates. Just 4 numbers and an arrow pointing east. The numbers meant nothing until you compared them with an older assay book. The mine used sequential sample tags, and the 4 numbers belonged to late 1951. They had been taken after the tunnel was already several hundred feet long. The missing grades opened a different possibility. Maybe 7B was not embarrassing because it failed. Maybe the problem began when it started to work. You brought the maps, payroll ledger, photograph, and sample numbers to a mining geologist who had spent years evaluating old hard rock properties. He did not get excited when you told him you owned a $1 gold mine. He had heard plenty of $1 mine stories. Most abandoned mines are abandoned for excellent reasons. He looked at the 1951 map for less than a minute before pointing to the direction of 7B. The tunnel was not following the old vein. It was cutting across the formation toward a different structure. If the company believed a parallel vein existed east of the main workings, 7B made sense as a search tunnel. 600 feet of expensive hope, driven across mostly weak ground toward a separate target. You asked what would make them keep going that far while the rest of the mine was shutting down. He gave the simplest answer. Good indications. Not necessarily gold, maybe altered rock, quartz, sulfides, a fault contact, something strong enough to convince them the target was still ahead. Then he noticed another detail. The final 80 feet of 7B also passed close to an old mineral rights boundary shown on a separate property map. Not clearly outside it. Close. Close enough that a valuable discovery could have started an ownership fight. That left two very different problems sitting in the same place. A fatal accident, and a possible discovery near a boundary. But theories were cheap. The only real answer was behind the wall. Opening it was not as simple as pulling rocks away. The seal had been sitting for decades, and nobody knew what pressure, bad air, water, or unstable ground could be trapped on the other side. The contractor brought ventilation equipment and gas monitors. The first opening was made from a distance, small enough to test the atmosphere before anyone approached. When the drill finally broke through, air moved out of the hole. Not much. Just enough to make everyone stop talking. The monitor showed low oxygen at first, then improved as fresh air was pushed through. The opening widened slowly. Behind the outer rubble was old timber. Behind the timber was packed waste rock. Behind the waste rock was empty space. Then your light caught steel. Two rails continued into the darkness. Tunnel 7B. For 75 years, it had been sitting exactly where the map said it was. Before the first entry, the contractor made you stop at the gate and go through the rules again. Stay behind him. Do not touch unsupported timber. Do not step over anything without checking what is on the other side. If the monitor alarms, turn around immediately. If he says out, you go out. No argument. The rules changed the way the tunnel felt. Every old board had a purpose you did not understand. Every dark opening that looked harmless could be a raise, a pocket, or a hole with no floor. The mind did not feel haunted. It felt indifferent. That was worse. The first 100 feet gave you nothing. Rough walls, rusted air pipe, dust over the rail. Around 200 feet, the rock turned darker. Near 250, old blasting wire fragments curled against one wall, and a broken wooden box still held rusted drill steel. Men had spent real time in here. At 300 feet, you found the remains of a small ore car pushed to the side. The geologist looked inside. Waste rock. Near 370 feet, one wall showed a row of old sample cuts. He checked the exposed rock and shook his head. Weak alteration. Thin quartz. Nothing that explained why a dying mine kept spending money eastward. At 400 feet, the drift bent slightly north. Then the timber got heavier. Closer sets. Extra braces. Repairs on top of repairs. Near 480 feet, fallen rock narrowed the passage enough that the contractor stopped the inspection. The ground ahead needed support before anyone went farther. Beside one old timber was a corroded metal station tag. The stamp matched a survey station on the 1951 map. The paper, geometry, and the tunnel were still lining up. The geologist took 4 fresh samples from the exposed rock around the fall. Mostly altered volcanic rock, a few quartz stringers, some sulfide staining. Interesting geology, but nothing that looked like a fortune. If those samples came back rich, you would finally have a reason for the secrecy. If they came back poor, the simplest explanation would get much harder to avoid. A worker died, management sealed an embarrassing heading, and the mine shut down. The lab results arrived 4 days later. You opened the report on your phone. The first sample was almost nothing. The second was slightly better. The third contained gold, but not enough to explain 600 feet of tunnel, an after-hours crew, or the missing records around 7B. The fourth was worse than the third. For a few minutes, the mystery shrank into something ordinary. A failing mine chased a weak target. A worker died. Management sealed the heading, closed the property, and moved on. Ugly, but simple. You almost accepted it. Then the geologist asked you one question. How far had you actually gone? You checked the inspection notes, from the old entrance to the unstable section, a little over 480 feet. You checked the 1951 survey. 7B was almost 600 feet long. You had not reached the end. You were still more than 100 feet short. You went back to the map expecting the 100-foot difference to be a measurement error. Old surveys can drift. Distances can be written from different reference points. A bend underground can make a straight-line estimate misleading. So you and the geologist rebuilt the route station by station. The first turn matched. The long straight section matched. The slight north bend matched. The old drill station matched a marked point on the 1951 sheet. The survey was not perfect, but it was far too close for 100 feet to vanish by accident. Then he pointed to the final symbol on the old map. The line widened just before the end, a tiny detail you had treated like sloppy pencil work. He said it could mark a small working cut off the drift. A pocket. A stope. A place where miners stopped driving straight ahead and started removing rocks sideways or upward. What if the tunnel itself was never the important part? What if 7B was only the road to the real working? The first 480 feet had carried you through mostly weak ground. The old survey said the interesting part was still ahead, and the bad assays had only told you what was at the fall. They said nothing about the missing 100 feet. What was in the last 100 feet? The stabilization work took several days. New support went in around the fallen section. Loose ground was scaled down. The route was checked again. When you returned, the passage continued. 500 feet. The walls changed. Thin quartz stringers became more frequent. 530. A rusted, compressed air line ended beside an old drill station. 550. The drift widened enough for 2 men to work side by side. Then, at roughly 560 feet, you hit another wall. This one was different. Not rubble packed from the outside. Heavy timbers had been set across the tunnel and covered with boards. Behind the boards was broken rock. A second seal. You stood there with the 1951 map in your hand. According to the survey, the tunnel continued beyond you. So now you had a sealed tunnel inside a sealed tunnel. The first wall had hidden 7B from the mine. The second wall was hiding something from 7B. Nobody had a good explanation for that. The contractor checked the area. The ground around the barrier was stable enough to investigate, but once again, the fill had to be opened carefully. One board came off. Then another. Behind the rock was a narrow gap. Air moved through it. You pushed a camera past the opening before anyone entered. For the first few seconds, the image showed dust. Then the beam found the opposite wall. White quartz. Not a thin stringer. A band thick enough to fill most of the frame. The geologist leaned toward the screen and said nothing. That silence told you more than excitement would have. The opening was widened. Beyond the barrier was not another normal drift. It was a small working chamber cut upward and sideways from the tunnel. Old drill holes covered one face. Broken rock lay under a wooden chute. Rusted tools remained where somebody had dropped them. And across the far wall ran a quartz structure streaked with dark mineralization. This was the working the 1952 map had deleted along with the tunnel. The camera showed one more detail before it came back out. On the floor beyond the quartz face was a short length of rail that did not point forward with the tunnel. It turned toward the chamber. That meant they had intended to move rock out of here, not just inspect it. Move it. The geologist traced the vein with his light and stopped where the dark band disappeared behind the right wall. If the mineralized structure continued in that direction, the old crew may have been preparing to open the chamber farther when work suddenly stopped. You looked for the signs of an orderly shutdown. Tools stacked for removal, pipe disconnected, rail pulled up for reuse. Anything suggesting the crew had finished and cleaned out. You found the opposite. A hammer still hung from a spike. Drill steel lay against the wall. The chute contained broken rock. A small length of hose remained attached to an air fitting. It looked less like a completed job than a job interrupted. That did not prove the accident happened here, or that anyone expected to return the next morning. But it did make the shutdown look abrupt. How fast did they leave? Old hard rock operations reused almost anything worth hauling back out. Rail, tools, pipe, hardware. Leaving usable gear deep underground usually means retrieving it became dangerous, urgent, or simply not worth the exposure. There were no bars or boxes waiting in the dark. What the chamber preserved was simpler. Somebody had been working here. Then, abruptly, they were not. But you still did not know if the rock was rich. Old mines are full of beautiful quartz that contains almost no gold. The geologist took samples across the structure instead of picking only the best-looking pieces. One from the left side, one from the center, one across the darker band, one from broken material under the chute, one farther back where the vein narrowed. Then you noticed small pencil marks on one timber. 4 numbers. The same 4 numbers from the torn strip in the payroll ledger. Not similar. The same sequence. For the first time, you had a location tied to all 4 missing sample-ids. The old crew had sampled this chamber. Whatever those 1951 grades were, the result sheets were gone by the time 7B disappeared from the later map. You could prove the working had been sampled. You still could not prove what those original assays said. The new samples went to the lab. This time, waiting felt different. You were not asking whether an abandoned mine contained traces of gold. Nearly every old gold mine does. You were asking whether the final working contained enough gold to explain why anyone had cared about it in 1951. The first result came back low. The second was better. The third was equivalent to roughly 1.5 ounces of gold per ton. The fourth was just over 2 ounces per ton. The fifth dropped again. The vein was not uniformly rich, but 2 samples were dramatically higher than the grades shown in the mine's surviving final year records. Not a guaranteed ore body. Real high-grade mineralization. Enough to make a dying operation pay attention. You asked the geologist the question everyone would ask. How much gold is down there? He refused to guess. 1 chamber and 5 samples cannot tell you the size of an ore body. The structure might pinch out 10 feet beyond the wall. It might continue 50 feet. It might extend hundreds. Without drilling, mapping, ownership review, permits, engineering, and a serious amount of money, nobody could responsibly put a value on it. But he would say one thing with confidence. Whatever ultimately killed 7B, barren rock at the final working, was not the whole explanation. If the crew had reached good gold, why did the work stop? The timeline began to matter. The after-hours crew worked 7B for 5 weeks. The sample numbers appeared near the end of that period. The fatal accident happened days later. The tunnel disappeared from the next map, and the company declared the mine exhausted soon after. The old claim boundary added another complication. The hidden chamber sat dangerously close to where the company's documented mineral rights ended. Surveying standards from the period were not perfect, and the exact underground position would need modern verification. But if management believed the new vein crossed into disputed ground, announcing a discovery could have triggered ownership questions at the worst possible moment. There was also money above ground. Surviving company filings showed that management had been consolidating ownership during the mine's final year, buying out small shareholders who believed the property was nearly finished. A valuable new discovery before those transactions were complete could have changed what those shares were worth. None of that proved a conspiracy. But it did establish motive. An exploration heading worked after hours near a boundary. A high-grade discovery. A worker killed during the final weeks. A company already winding the mine down. Then, a sealed tunnel and a cleaner map. You could prove the tunnel existed. You could prove a separate crew worked it at night. You could prove one of those workers died in a mining accident on the property. You could prove the next surviving map removed the heading. And now you could prove there was high-grade gold at the end of it. What you could not prove was the conversation that happened after the accident. Maybe management decided the ground was too dangerous. Maybe the legal risk was worse than the gold was worth. Maybe the company wanted the discovery quiet until ownership issues were settled and never got the chance to return. Maybe somebody intended to reopen 7B later, after the mine was officially closed. Or maybe sealing it was simply the fastest way to bury every problem at once. There was one final detail in the boxes. A letter you had read before but never understood. It was dated February 1952, written from one company officer to another. Most of it discussed equipment sales and outstanding accounts. Near the bottom was one sentence about the East work. It did not mention 7B. It did not mention gold. It said only that the East work was to remain undisturbed until the ownership matter was settled. The ownership matter. You looked at the date. It was written after the company had already told the outside world the mine was exhausted. Whatever the East work was, somebody still cared about it, and they expected it to remain there, undisturbed. For the first time, the $1 sale felt less like a joke and more like an accident of time. Nobody had sold you a known fortune for $1. The people who knew what 7B meant were gone. The company disappeared decades ago. Ownership changed hands. Records were scattered. The portal sat behind a gate while the desert erased the road one storm at a time. Eventually, the mine became what the paperwork said it was. Empty. Worthless. Finished. Until one old map survived in a cardboard box. You returned to the hidden chamber one more time with the geologist. The quartz was still just rock under a work light. The ore chute was still full of broken material nobody had hauled out. Drill holes crossed the face where the 1951 crew had stopped. You tried to reconstruct the final weeks. By October, 7B had already been driven nearly 600 feet. Then 6 men were assigned extra shifts at its east end. The chamber was sampled. A miner died days later. Within months, 7B was gone from the surviving map. 75 years later, you were standing in the place all of those lines converged. The obvious temptation was to call it treasure. But the truth was more complicated. Gold in the wall is not money in your bank account. Reopening a historic mine could cost more than the metal is worth. The chamber could be the richest 20 feet in the entire property and still never become a profitable operation. Permitting alone could take years. Ground support, drilling, environmental work, access, power, water, insurance, engineering, legal review. The $1 mine could still become a $1 million problem. The gold was not the clean ending you might expect. The evidence around it was more important. You bought a property because everyone agreed its best days were over. Then one line on one old map forced you to question that agreement. The line led to a buried rail. The rail led to a sealed tunnel. The tunnel led to a payroll code. The payroll code led to a dead worker. The dead worker led back underground. The first samples told you almost nothing. The missing 100 feet told you to keep looking. And the second wall led to the one thing the official history said should not be there. Good gold. Not enough to make you rich. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But enough to prove that the mine's final chapter had been written before the digging actually stopped. You now have a modern underground survey planned for the east side of the property. If it places the chamber inside the mineral rights, the next decision is whether a permitted drill program is worth the cost. That is the part no old map can answer. At the beginning, all you wanted to know was why one line disappeared. Now the unanswered part is inside the rock beyond the chamber. A few short core holes could kill the entire dream. If the vein pinches out, or the grades collapse, the $1 mine becomes exactly what everyone always said it was. An old property with one unusually rich pocket and a very good story. But if the structure continues, the erased tunnel stops being a historical curiosity. It becomes the entrance to an ore body the last crew may have discovered and never had the chance to define. Either result would settle the part that has been open since 1951. Not exactly why 7B was erased. The records still do not let you prove one single motive. But you now know why somebody could have wanted it gone. And the question left in front of you is bigger. How much did they leave behind? Because 75 years ago, somebody sealed a tunnel, removed it from the map, and told the world this mine had nothing left. Then you bought it for $1.